Elizabeth Montgomery stood before Judge Harrison, her designer heels clicking against the polished courthouse floor. At 45, she had never imagined herself in this position, facing consequences for her actions for the first time in her privileged life. The judge's stern gaze bore into her as he delivered the sentence. Ms. Montgomery, given your involvement in the tax evasion scheme at your father's company, this court sentences you to 6 months of community service. Judge Harrison's voice echoed through the courtroom. You will serve as a cafeteria worker at Lincoln Elementary School, where you will learn the value of honest work and service to others. Elizabeth's perfectly manicured fingers gripped the defendant's table. A cafeteria worker. She, the daughter of William Montgomery, CEO of Montgomery Industries, the very thought made her stomach turn. Your Honor, surely there must be some alternative, her lawyer intervened. But Judge Harrison's decision was final. Ms. Montgomery has lived a life of extreme privilege, using her position to help conceal millions in corporate funds. It's time she understood how the other half lives. The judge's words cut through her like ice. The next morning, Elizabeth pulled up to Lincoln Elementary in her Mercedes, parking it between 2 modest sedans. The school building was old, its red brick facade showing years of wear. As she walked toward the entrance, she clutched her Hermes bag closer, feeling completely out of place. Mrs. Rodriguez, the head of food services, greeted her with a knowing look. Welcome to the real world, Ms. Montgomery. Your uniform is in the break room. She handed Elizabeth a hairnet and a pair of non-slip shoes that looked nothing like the Italian leather she was accustomed to. I don't understand why I have to do this, Elizabeth muttered, changing into the unfamiliar uniform. I could simply make a donation to the school. Money isn't always the answer, Ms. Montgomery, Mrs. Rodriguez replied, her voice firm but not unkind. Sometimes, what people need is someone who cares enough to show up and do the work. The kitchen was hot and noisy, nothing like the executive offices Elizabeth was used to. The smell of industrial cleaning products, mixed with cooking food, assaulted her senses. As she struggled to tie her apron, a small commotion near the serving line caught her attention. A young boy, no more than 7, stood at the counter, his clothes worn and slightly too small. I'm sorry, Tommy, one of the cafeteria workers was saying, but your account is empty again. Elizabeth watched as the boy's shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the floor. Before she knew what she was doing, she stepped forward. I'll pay for his lunch, she said, reaching for her purse. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped her with a gentle hand. That's not how we handled these situations, Ms. Montgomery. We have a system in place. Come with me, and I'll show you how we really help these children. As Elizabeth followed Mrs. Rodriguez to her office, she couldn't shake the image of Tommy's disappointed face. She had never thought about children going hungry at school. In her world, such problems didn't exist, or at least she had never bothered to notice them. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled out a thick folder. We have over 200 students on our free and reduced lunch program, she explained. For many of them, the meals they get here are the only reliable source of nutrition they have all day. Elizabeth felt something shift inside her as she looked at the numbers. These weren't just statistics on a page. These were real children, like Tommy, who depended on this cafeteria for their basic needs. But surely there's something more we can do, Elizabeth said, her voice softer than before. There must be a way to ensure no child goes hungry. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled, seeing the first crack in Elizabeth's carefully constructed walls. Perhaps that's why you're here, Ms. Montgomery. Sometimes the greatest changes come from unexpected places. As Elizabeth left the school that evening, her designer clothes back on, but somehow feeling different against her skin, she couldn't stop thinking about Tommy and the hundreds of other children like him. She had always viewed community service as a punishment, but as she drove home in her luxury car, she began to wonder if perhaps it was something else entirely, an opportunity for transformation. Her phone buzzed with messages from her usual social circle, invitations to charity galas and luxury spa days. For the first time in her life, these things felt hollow. meaningless compared to the real needs she had witnessed today. Looking at her reflection in the rear-view mirror, Elizabeth hardly recognized herself. Not because of the slight smudge of flour on her cheek or the way her carefully styled hair had wilted in the kitchen's heat, but because of the look in her eyes. A look that suggested she was seeing the world and herself in an entirely new way. What she didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. The next 6 months would challenge everything she thought she knew about wealth, privilege, and what it truly means to make a difference in the world. And somewhere between the industrial-sized ovens and the serving lines, Elizabeth Montgomery would discover a purpose far greater than she had ever imagined. 2 weeks into her community service, Elizabeth found herself arriving at Lincoln Elementary earlier than required. The morning air was crisp, and the school parking lot was nearly empty except for a few dedicated staff members' cars. She had traded her Mercedes for a more modest SUV after realizing how out of place it looked, though she told herself it was just to avoid scratches in the crowded lot. As she approached the kitchen's back entrance, she heard muffled sobs. Behind the dumpster, she found Maria, one of the younger kitchen workers, crying quietly into her hands. "What's wrong?" Elizabeth asked, surprising herself with the genuine concern in her voice. Maria quickly wiped her eyes. "It's nothing, Ms. Montgomery. Just, my daughter's birthday is coming up, and after paying for car repairs, I can't afford the science camp she wanted to attend. She's so bright, and this would have meant everything to her." Elizabeth's hand instinctively moved toward her purse, but she stopped herself, remembering Mrs. Rodriguez's words about money not always being the answer. Instead, she asked, "Tell me more about your daughter." As Maria spoke about 12-year-old Sophia's passion for chemistry and dreams of becoming a scientist, Elizabeth's mind raced with possibilities. She had connections, many of them, but she had never used them for anything beyond advancing her own interests. Inside the kitchen, Elizabeth tied on her apron with practiced ease now, her movements more confident than those first awkward days. As she prepared for the morning rush, she couldn't shake thoughts of Maria and Sophia, or of Tommy, whose situation she'd learned more about. His father had lost his job 6 months ago, and his mother worked 2 jobs to keep their family afloat. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared beside her, checking the temperature of the industrial ovens. "You're getting better at this," she observed, nodding at Elizabeth's efficiently organized workstation. "I've been thinking," Elizabeth said, measuring portions for the day's lunch. "The food we serve, it's nutritionally balanced, but it's basic. Couldn't we do more?" "With what budget?" Mrs. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "We're already stretched thin." Elizabeth felt a familiar spark, the same one she used to get when tackling complex financial challenges at her father's company. "Show me the numbers," she said. During her lunch break, instead of retreating to her car, as she had the first week, Elizabeth sat in Mrs. Rodriguez's office, poring over budget sheets and supplier contracts. Her business acumen, previously used for tax evasion, now focused on finding legitimate ways to stretch every dollar. "Look at this," she pointed out. "We're ordering from 5 different suppliers, each with their own delivery fees. If we consolidated and negotiated bulk rates..." Her finger traced down the column of numbers. Mrs. Rodriguez leaned forward, intrigued. "Go on." But their discussion was interrupted by a commotion in the cafeteria. They rushed out to find Tommy standing rigid, his lunch tray shattered on the floor, while a group of better-dressed students laughed nearby. "He's wearing his brother's old clothes again," whispered one of the kitchen staff. Elizabeth felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. She walked over, her presence silencing the laughter. With gentle hands, she helped Tommy pick up the scattered food. "Come with me," she said softly. In the kitchen, as she prepared a fresh lunch for Tommy, Elizabeth noticed his worn backpack, the frayed edges of his shirt. She remembered her own childhood, how she had taken for granted the endless supply of new things, the security of never having to worry about her next meal. "You know," she said, adding an extra portion of fresh fruit to his tray, "I used to think being strong meant never needing help from anyone. I was wrong. The strongest people are often those who face the biggest challenges. Tommy looked up at her, his eyes wise beyond his years. Is that why you're here? Because you're facing challenges? Elizabeth felt her carefully constructed worldview shift further. Yes, she admitted, and I'm learning more than I ever expected. That evening, Elizabeth sat in her luxury apartment, surrounded by evidence of her privileged life, but feeling increasingly disconnected from it. Her phone buzzed with a message from her father. The lawyers think they can get your service term reduced. Say the word. She stared at the message for a long time before typing her response. No, I need to do this. Opening her laptop, she began researching about school nutrition programs, about successful initiatives in other districts, about grant opportunities. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she drafted proposals and plans. A text from Maria appeared. Sophia got accepted to the science camp, but we had to decline. She's trying to be brave about it. Elizabeth smiled, already formulating a plan. She had connections at the university's science department, connections she'd previously used only for networking at charity events. Perhaps it was time to use them for something meaningful. As she worked late into the night, Elizabeth realized she was feeling something unfamiliar. Purpose. The hollow satisfaction of her previous life, the parties, the shopping, the superficial relationships, seemed to fade in comparison to the concrete problems she could help solve. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from one of her old social circle. Darling, you've missed 3 charity galas. Are you still doing that dreadful cafeteria thing? Elizabeth looked at her reflection in the darkened window of her apartment. The woman who stared back was different from the one who had stood before Judge Harrison weeks ago. Her perfectly maintained facade was showing cracks, but through those cracks, something authentic was emerging. She turned back to her laptop, ignoring the message. Tomorrow would bring new challenges at Lincoln Elementary, but for the first time in her life, Elizabeth Montgomery was exactly where she wanted to be. What she didn't know was that her greatest challenge and opportunity for real change was still to come. The next morning would bring a health inspection that would threaten to shut down the cafeteria, forcing Elizabeth to confront not only the system's limitations, but also her own family's role in the community's inequality. The transformation that had begun in her heart would soon need to manifest in bold, public action. The health inspector's arrival coincided with the morning rush, his clipboard and stern expression creating ripples of anxiety throughout the kitchen. Elizabeth was elbow-deep in food prep when Mrs. Rodriguez rushed in, her usually calm demeanor fractured by worry. "Mr. Peterson is here early," she whispered urgently, "and he's already found 3 violations in the storage area." Elizabeth's stomach dropped as she watched the inspector methodically making his way through their workspace. She recognized his type, the same rigid dedication to rules and regulations she'd once exploited in her father's business dealings. But this time, she was on the other side of the equation. The refrigeration unit is operating 2 degrees above acceptable parameters, Mr. Peterson announced, making another mark on his clipboard. And these ceiling tiles show evidence of water damage, potential mold risk. Elizabeth watched Mrs. Rodriguez's face fall. They'd been requesting maintenance for months, but the school district's budget constraints had left them waiting. Each mark on that clipboard represented another strike against them, another reason to shut down the only reliable source of nutrition for hundreds of children. During her lunch break, Elizabeth made a call she'd been avoiding. "Father," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I need to talk to you about Montgomery Industries' community investment program." William Montgomery's laugh was cold and familiar. "Elizabeth, dear, are you still playing lunch lady? I thought you'd have tired of this charade by now." "The school's kitchen needs repairs," she pressed on. "The company's foundation could—" "Absolutely not," he cut her off. "We invest in prestigious universities and arts programs, not elementary school cafeterias. It's about image, Elizabeth. You used to understand that." As she hung up, Elizabeth caught her reflection in the kitchen's steel surface. She did understand image. She understood that her father's company maintained theirs by keeping their charitable giving as far removed from real need as possible. The inspection continued through the afternoon, each new violation adding to the weight in Elizabeth's chest. But it was Tommy's face, his quiet acceptance when told the kitchen might have to close, that finally broke something loose inside her. That evening, Elizabeth sat in her apartment, surrounded by financial documents and legal papers. Her father's company had always been strategic about their charitable giving, carefully selecting causes that offered the best tax advantages and social connections. She had helped design many of those strategies herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Sophia's been crying since she heard about the inspection. She says the cafeteria is her safe place. Elizabeth's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, accessing accounts she hadn't touched in months. Her trust fund, the golden handcuffs that had kept her tethered to her father's influence, sat untouched, accumulating interest while children went hungry. A knock at her door interrupted her calculations. She opened it to find Mrs. Rodriguez standing there, looking somehow both smaller and stronger than she did at school. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Mrs. Rodriguez said, "but I thought you should see this." She handed Elizabeth a stack of papers, letters from parents and children, each one describing what the school lunch program meant to them. As Elizabeth read through them, her vision blurred with tears. Stories of single mothers working multiple jobs, of fathers laid off during the recession, of children whose only reliable meals came from their cafeteria. These weren't just statistics anymore. They were real people with names and faces she knew. "We need $50,000 for the repairs and upgrades," Mrs. Rodriguez said quietly. "The district says they might have the funds in next year's budget, but we'll be shut down by then," Elizabeth finished. She stood up, her decision already made. "I need you to trust me. I know what we have to do." The next morning, Elizabeth arrived at Lincoln Elementary earlier than usual. She had spent the night making calls, pulling strings she'd never thought she'd use again, but this time for a different purpose. As she walked into the kitchen, she found Mr. Peterson already there, adding to his list of violations. But instead of fear, she felt a strange calm. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her former life, "I need to show you something." She laid out a series of documents on the prep table, contracts, work orders, and most importantly, a certified check for the full amount needed for repairs and upgrades. "The work begins today," she explained, watching his eyes widen as he reviewed the papers. "I've contracted the city's top restaurant equipment supplier and a licensed construction crew. Everything will be up to code within the week." "These repairs," Mr. Peterson began, "they're extensive and expensive. How did you—" "I sold my apartment," Elizabeth said simply, "and my car. It turns out I don't need as much as I thought I did." The kitchen staff, who had gathered to witness the exchange, stood in shocked silence. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her eyes questioning. "Elizabeth, you can't—" "I can," Elizabeth interrupted, "and I did, but there's something else." She pulled out another document, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm establishing a foundation, separate from my father's company, specifically for school nutrition programs. The paperwork will be finalized this afternoon." The impact of her words rippled through the kitchen, but Elizabeth wasn't finished. She turned to Mr. Peterson, her voice firm. "We'll need a temporary permit to operate while the repairs are being made. These children can't miss their meals." Mr. Peterson looked from the documents to Elizabeth's determined face, then to the hopeful expressions of the kitchen staff. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "Submit the permit application by noon. I'll expedite it myself." As the news spread through the school, Elizabeth felt something shift inside her. She had spent years helping her father's company avoid taxes and responsibilities, using her skills to protect wealth rather than share it. Now those same skills were being used to feed children, to protect the vulnerable, to make a real difference. Her phone buzzed. Her father. She let it go to voicemail, knowing this was just the beginning of a battle she was finally ready to fight. The Elizabeth Montgomery who had walked into this kitchen 2 months ago would have been terrified of losing her position in high society, of disappointing her father, of stepping out of line. But that Elizabeth was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who understood that true worth wasn't measured in designer labels or social standings, but in the difference you make in others' lives. As she tied on her apron and prepared for the lunch rush, Elizabeth knew there would be consequences for her actions. Her father wouldn't take this rebellion lightly, and her decision would send shockwaves through their social circle. But watching Tommy walk in with a bright smile, seeing Sophia hugging her mother by the kitchen door, Elizabeth knew she had finally found something worth fighting for. The renovation crews had barely begun their work when William Montgomery's sleek black car pulled up to Lincoln Elementary. Elizabeth saw it from the kitchen window and steeled herself for the confrontation she knew was coming. Her father's appearance in this part of town was unprecedented, a clear sign of how seriously he was taking her rebellion. She met him in the school's empty cafeteria, still wearing her kitchen uniform, a stark contrast to his immaculate business suit. The sound of construction work echoed through the halls as workers began replacing the aging equipment. "Have you completely lost your mind?" William's voice was controlled but sharp. "Selling your apartment, emptying your accounts, throwing away everything we've built, and for what? A school cafeteria?" Elizabeth stood her ground, feeling stronger in her simple uniform than she ever had in designer clothes. "No, Father. For the first time in my life, I'm thinking clearly. I'm using our privilege to make a real difference." "Real difference?" he scoffed, gesturing around the modest cafeteria. This is beneath you, Elizabeth, beneath our family name. You were raised for better things than serving lunch to what, Father?" Elizabeth's voice cut through his dismissal. "To children who deserve a chance. To families working harder than we ever have just to survive. Is that beneath us?" William's expression hardened. "You're making a spectacle of yourself. The board members are talking. Our social circle is questioning your stability. I've spent decades building our reputation. A reputation built on avoiding responsibilities," Elizabeth interrupted, "on finding clever ways to keep our wealth while ignoring the community that helped create it. I know because I helped you do it." She watched her father's face redden with anger, but before he could respond, the cafeteria doors opened. Tommy walked in, followed by his father, a man Elizabeth had never met, but whose story she knew well. He was thin, wearing clothes that had seen better days. But he carried himself with dignity. "Miss Montgomery!" Tommy called out, then stopped short at the sight of William. "Oh, sorry, we didn't mean to interrupt." Elizabeth smiled warmly. "You're not interrupting at all, Tommy. This is my father." She turned to William. "Father, this is Tommy and Mr. Rodriguez." Tommy's father recently found a new job, thanks to the employment program our kitchen staff helped connect him with. William shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct contact with the people his business decisions affected. Tommy's father stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Montgomery, your daughter has changed lives here, not just with food, but with hope. She sees us as people, not problems." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Elizabeth watched her father struggle to maintain his usual detached demeanor in the face of real human impact. "The foundation paperwork is already filed," Elizabeth said quietly. "I'm not asking for your approval anymore, Father. I'm asking you to open your eyes and see what I've seen." Before William could respond, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. "Elizabeth, the reporter from the City Tribune is here. They want to do a story on the renovation and the new foundation." William's head snapped up. "Reporter? Elizabeth, you can't possibly—" "Actually, I can," Elizabeth said firmly. "It's time people saw what's really happening in our community. Time they understood that school nutrition isn't charity, it's justice." She turned to leave, then paused. "You taught me that image is everything. Father, Well, I'm creating a new image, one of responsibility, of genuine community investment. You can either be part of it, or you can watch from the sidelines as our family name comes to mean something truly worthwhile. The next few days were a whirlwind. The story in the City Tribune sparked national interest. Other wealthy families, perhaps shamed by Elizabeth's example, began reaching out about supporting similar initiatives. The renovation proceeded ahead of schedule, with local contractors offering discounted services after hearing about the project. But not everything was positive. Elizabeth received cold shoulders and cutting remarks from her old social circle. Several board members at Montgomery Industries publicly questioned her father's leadership, suggesting that her actions reflected poorly on the company's image. One evening, as Elizabeth was reviewing applications for the foundation's first grant cycle, her phone buzzed with a message from her father's assistant. The board was calling an emergency meeting. There was talk of removing William Montgomery as CEO, citing the public relations crisis sparked by his daughter's erratic behavior. Elizabeth felt the weight of unintended consequences settling on her shoulders. She had meant to challenge the system, not destroy her father's position within it. But as she looked around the newly renovated kitchen, saw the hope in the eyes of the staff and students, she knew she couldn't back down. That night, she received an unexpected visitor at her modest new apartment. Her mother, Catherine Montgomery, who had remained silent throughout the controversy, stood at her door. "Mom!" Elizabeth stepped back, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Catherine entered, her elegant appearance at odds with the simple surroundings. She looked around the small space, taking in the grant proposals spread across the dining table, the thank you letters from students pinned to the wall. "Your father is scared," Catherine said finally, "not just of losing control of the company, but of losing you, of losing everything he thinks defines him." She paused, touching one of the children's letters. "But watching you these past months, I've never been prouder." Elizabeth felt tears welling up. Dad's position at the company is less important than doing what's right," Catherine finished. She pulled an envelope from her purse. "I've been doing some thinking of my own. This is the paperwork to transfer control of my personal inheritance to your foundation. It's time the Montgomery name stood for something more than profit." Elizabeth stared at the envelope, understanding the magnitude of what her mother was offering. It wasn't just money, it was a complete shift in their family's legacy. As mother and daughter embraced, Elizabeth's phone buzzed again. Mrs. Rodriguez had sent a photo of Sophia teaching younger students about nutrition in the cafeteria after school. Using the new demonstration kitchen Elizabeth had included in the renovation plans, the image captured everything Elizabeth had been fighting for: education, empowerment, community. But her battle wasn't over yet. The board meeting loomed, and with it, a choice: step back to save her father's position, or push forward to create lasting change. Elizabeth looked at the photo again, then at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. She knew what she had to do. Tomorrow would bring either the greatest challenge or the greatest opportunity of her life. Either way, there was no going back to who she used to be. The morning of the board meeting dawned clear and cold. Elizabeth stood in her small apartment's kitchen, sipping coffee from a practical mug that had replaced her fine china collection. Her old power suits were gone, sold along with everything else, but she had borrowed one from her mother for today. Some battles required armor, even if it wasn't the kind she used to wear. Her phone buzzed with messages of support from the Lincoln Elementary staff. Mrs. Rodriguez had organized the kitchen to run without her today, understanding the importance of what she faced. The last message was a photo of Tommy and his classmates holding up hand-drawn signs. "We believe in Ms. Montgomery." The Montgomery Industries headquarters loomed before her, its glass and steel exterior reflecting the morning sun. As Elizabeth walked through the lobby, she noticed how employees stopped and whispered. She was no longer just the CEO's daughter. She was the woman who had challenged the very foundation of their corporate culture. The boardroom was packed, Board members, executives, and legal representatives filled every chair. Her father sat at the head of the table, looking older than she had ever seen him. The discussion about his leadership had clearly taken its toll. "Ms. Montgomery," the board chairman began, "you understand why we're here. Your recent actions have caused significant concern among our shareholders and partners. Your father's perceived inability to control this situation has raised questions about his leadership." Elizabeth stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "Yes, I understand why we're here, but you're wrong about one thing. This isn't about control. It's about responsibility." She opened her laptop, connecting it to the room's presentation system. Images filled the screen: the renovated kitchen at Lincoln Elementary, children receiving nutritious meals, families attending community education programs in the new space. "You're worried about the company's image?" Elizabeth's voice was strong and clear. "Let me show you what a truly powerful image looks like." She clicked through slides showing local news coverage, social media response, and letters from other business leaders praising the initiative. "Our foundation's work has generated more positive press than any corporate charity gala ever did. We're not just writing checks for tax deductions anymore. We're creating real change." One of the board members leaned forward. "That's all very touching, Ms. Montgomery, but this company's primary responsibility is to its shareholders." "Is it?" Elizabeth pulled up another slide, this one showing financial projections. "Since our initiative began, 3 major ethical investment funds have expressed interest in Montgomery Industries. Our company's reputation for community involvement has opened doors to contracts we couldn't access before. It turns out doing good is good business." She turned to her father, who sat quietly watching. "Dad, you taught me that image is everything, but you never specified what that image had to be. What if instead of being known as the company that avoids responsibility, we became the company that embraces it?" Catherine Montgomery, who had slipped quietly into the room, spoke up from the back. "I've pledged my personal inheritance to Elizabeth's foundation. The Montgomery name will be associated with this work whether the company participates or not. The question is whether you want to be on the right side of this change." Murmurs rippled through the room. Catherine's inheritance represented a significant portion of the family's wealth. Her public alignment with Elizabeth's cause carried weight. Elizabeth continued, her voice softening. "We're not just feeding children. We're investing in our community's future. Every child who doesn't have to worry about hunger is a child who can focus on learning. Every parent who knows their kid is getting a good meal is a parent who can focus on working and providing. This isn't charity, it's smart business and good citizenship rolled into one." She clicked to her final slide, showing Tommy's father in his new workplace, Sophia teaching younger students about nutrition, and the growing community program that had sprung up around the cafeteria. "The question isn't whether my father can control me," Elizabeth said, looking each board member in the eye. "The question is whether Montgomery Industries wants to lead the way in showing how corporate power can be used for real social good." William Montgomery stood slowly. The room fell silent, waiting for his response. "My daughter," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "has taught me something I should have learned long ago. The true measure of success isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we give back." He turned to the board. "I move that we formally partner with Elizabeth's foundation, making community nutrition and education a core part of our corporate mission. Not as a sidebar or a tax write-off, but as a fundamental aspect of who we are as a company." The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. Montgomery Industries would change direction, with Elizabeth's foundation serving as a model for corporate responsibility. As the meeting concluded, William approached his daughter. "I was wrong," he said simply. "You didn't diminish our family's legacy, you elevated it." 6 months later, Elizabeth's community service sentence was complete, but she had no intention of leaving Lincoln Elementary. The cafeteria had become a model for school nutrition programs across the country. Tommy's father headed a new job training program housed in the community center they'd built adjacent to the kitchen. Sophia had started a student-led nutrition education initiative that was spreading to other schools. Elizabeth still worked in the kitchen 3 days a week, now wearing her hairnet and non-slip shoes with pride. The other days were spent running the foundation, which had expanded to support similar programs in schools throughout the city. Her father had become one of the foundation's most vocal advocates, using his business connections to promote corporate responsibility, the Montgomery name, once synonymous with cold corporate success, now stood for something more meaningful. One morning, as Elizabeth prepared for the breakfast rush, Judge Harrison paid an unexpected visit to the cafeteria. He watched as she efficiently managed the kitchen, directing volunteers and greeting children by name. "When I sentenced you," he said, "I hoped you would learn something about honest work and service. I never imagined you would teach us all something about transformation and purpose." Elizabeth smiled, thinking of how far she had come from that first day in his courtroom. "Neither did I," she admitted. "But that's the thing about serving others. It has a way of showing you who you really are." The kitchen doors swung open as the first students arrived. Elizabeth took her place at the serving line, ready to start another day. She had found her true calling, not in spite of her privilege, but because of how she chose to use it. In the end, her greatest wealth wasn't in what she had given up, but in what she had gained: purpose, community, and the knowledge that one person's transformation could spark change far beyond themselves. Tommy waved from the line, wearing new clothes that fit properly now. Sophia stood at her demonstration station, preparing to teach her morning nutrition lesson. Mrs. Rodriguez orchestrated the controlled chaos of the kitchen with her usual grace. And Elizabeth Montgomery, former socialite turned lunch lady turned community champion, knew she was exactly where she belonged. The sentence that had seemed like punishment had become her pathway to purpose. She had lost a fortune, but gained something far more valuable: the understanding that true fulfillment comes not from what you have, but from what you give. And in that giving, she had found herself transformed from a privileged observer of life to an active participant in making it better for others. What would you do if life gave you an unexpected second chance? Have you ever witnessed someone's complete transformation, from living in a bubble of privilege to discovering their true purpose? When was the last time you saw someone sacrifice everything they had for what they believed in? Would you have the courage to start over, to rebuild yourself from scratch? Sometimes the most beautiful transformations happen in the most unexpected places. Just like Elizabeth, each of us has the power to change not only our own lives, but the lives of those around us. What moment in your life changed everything? What made you see the world differently? If this journey touched your heart, share your thoughts with our community. Your story matters. Your perspective could inspire others who are going through their own transformations. And for those seeking more stories that touch the soul and remind us of our shared humanity, look to your left. Another powerful journey awaits, one that will move you just as deeply. A story of courage, redemption, and discovering what truly matters in life. Don't miss it. Your support makes these stories possible. By subscribing, you become part of a community that believes in the power of transformation and human connection. Together, we can keep sharing these moments that remind us of our capacity for change, growth, and love. Every day, we bring you stories that matter, stories that touch hearts and change lives. Join us on this journey. Subscribe now and be part of something meaningful. Because every story has the power to change a life, and every viewer has the power to keep these stories alive. Remember, real change starts with a single step, a single decision, a single moment of clarity. What will your moment be?